And now on the line is Maeve Bateman, the Director of Financial Justice Ireland. Maeve, welcome to the programme.
Thanks very much.
Hey Maeve, I last spoke to you on Near FM approximately 2 years ago. Since then, your organisation has a new name. I understand as well that your organisation is a fairly long time on the go also. Can you start off by telling our listeners about why you've changed name and how your organisation is doing in general these last couple of years?
Sure. So we were founded in 1993 under the name Debt and Development Coalition Ireland. And at the time, we were, it was a lot of different organisations who came together who were concerned with the growing debt crisis in the global south. A lot of people who had been working in African countries particularly, who'd come home, lots of people from NGOs, different sectors like that. And the idea was that we would focus on that issue exclusively. And so part of what led to us changing our name was that over the intervening years, as well as working on debt, we've started to look at some other issues around the injustices in the financial system, like taxation, the role of public-private partnerships. And so we did a strategy review a couple of years ago, and one of the things we talked about was whether a new name might help people get more of a sense of the issues we work on. So debt is still crucial to our mission and to the things that we work on, but we feel Financial Justice Ireland kind of gets to the heart of what we're hoping to achieve. It was also to reflect the fact that we used to have an exclusive mandate to work on issues abroad in the global south, and now we also look at the way that the financial system affects people living in Ireland too.
Okay, cool. We can maybe talk a bit more about Ireland in a few minutes. We're doing this interview today to mainly talk about a public talk he's held recently on the IMF presence in South America. Could you tell me how the talk went and your views of the IMF in general in Financial Justice Ireland, Maeve?
Sure. So the talk was very interesting. We had a speaker over from the UK, Luis Vieira, who was from an organisation called the Bretton Woods Project. Now, the Bretton Woods Project are a watchdog who monitor the World Bank and the IMF. They're called the Bretton Woods Project because the World Bank and the IMF were originally founded in Bretton Woods in the 1940s. And so the Bretton Woods Project has a particular focus on the impact of the banking fund policies and activities on lots of areas, but particularly the environment, human rights and democratic governance. And so we asked Luis over as part of a course that we've been running with Latin America Solidarity Centre, LASC. So we'd jointly been running a program looking at financial justice in Latin America, and so he was invited for a public talk, but to sort of reflect on the policies of the IMF and the World Bank, and with a particular focus on Latin America. And so he told us quite a bit about the history of the IMF in Latin America, and particularly the influence of the Americans in the founding of the IMF, the evolving sort of positions over the years. And one of the things that a lot of people might be aware of if they know anything about the IMF, that has been particularly critical in Latin America, is the idea of structural adjustment programs. So structural adjustment is something where if the IMF come in to give a loan, then the sort of quid pro quo is that they will give a loan to a government that's struggling, but they'll require structural adjustment, so a change in government policies to give that loan. So it might be familiar to people as something that happened when the IMF came to Ireland. There were changes in some government policies here. But in Latin America, a lot of the things that have been done are things like labour markets being deregulated, privatisation, a change in financial system to allow more financial flows. And so for a lot of people, there's a sense that a lot of these policies have a negative effect on economies and have a negative effect on inequality in a given country. So they can generally lead, so for example. I think the estimate was something like 140,000 public employees lost their jobs as part of a commitment to reduce the size of the public sector. There was an increase in fees for public services, and there was an increase in VAT. So we kind of talked through some of the policies that happened as a result of IMF involvement and some of the impacts that they had.
Am I correct in saying that outside of the EU, the IMF is the first port of call for countries who are in big trouble financially?
Well, it's interesting. So the IMF were originally set up as sort of the bank of last resort, I guess. So the idea with the IMF is if you're struggling to get money from anywhere else, basically, that's when you would go to the IMF. Now, we found after the financial crisis that a lot of European countries ended up having to go to the IMF, which was very unusual. But another unusual change is that actually the role of the IMF in a lot of particularly countries in the global south, it's not as significant for the IMF and the World Bank. The World Bank would be more the development side of things. So with the World Bank, it will be less of a crisis if they were involved. But with both of them, you see that a lot of countries are now choosing to go to other lenders. So there's a big increase in the number of private lenders that countries are going to. There's an increase in loans coming directly from China, and there's also an increase in other multilateral lenders. So the IMF and the World Bank are both considered multilateral lenders, and that basically means that there's like a club of countries that are the members for where the money is coming from. But there are new multilateral lenders now as well. So there's an Asian Development Bank, an African Development Bank. There are BRICS. There's a BRICS bank with the so-called BRICS countries. And so it means that while the IMF are still crucial, now you'll find that when a country hits a debt burden or where their debt sustainability isn't what it should be, that there's often a number of different lenders who are in the mix. It's no longer just one, and this can be it can be a little bit more challenging in terms of if you're talking about debt cancellation or renegotiation. For example, back when we were founded, there was a big global public movement calling on richer countries to cancel the debt because a lot of these multilateral lenders, a lot of the money was coming from richer countries. A lot of the interest had been repaid many, many times over. And so there was a sense that citizens could put pressure on their governments to try and get this debt cancelled. And a huge number of people in Ireland signed petitions when we were involved in those campaigns. But when you add private lenders into the mix and a different mix, there's less of a direct ability for that to happen in the same way. But the IMF are still very important.
So you're saying the IMF is not being as commonly used nowadays as it was in the past?
I think it's more that it's not the only option,
Okay.
I guess. There are newer options out there, and, that has pluses and minuses. I mean, one of the things about the IMF is it has an official objective that it's meant to lend money. The IMF and the World Bank have sort of a development objective. So they're officially, they're not meant to be profit-making. They're not meant to be, it gives you a sort of an ability to call them out, I guess. When we would argue a lot of their policies have had a really negative impact, that it can build in austerity into countries, and it can have a bad effect on some of the countries where their loans happened. And one of the advantages of their structure is that there are ways for us to make those criticisms. It's a bit harder to do that with some other lenders, but equally some of those other lenders might not have the same restrictions. So it's changing. I guess the lenders are changing, but unfortunately, at the moment, there's recognition that there's another growing kind of global debt crisis coming. So while the lenders are maybe a different makeup than they were the last time, a lot of the problems are the same and a lot of the risks are the same.
Bearing in mind that the IMF were in Ireland several years ago for a few years, along with the ECB and someone else, am I right in saying that like how we in Ireland view the IMF is different to how many people outside of the EU, like in Latin America, view them? Or is it the same kind of a thing, like?
I think it probably depends on who you're asking and you know, who views them in what way. I think interestingly, it's one of the arguments made by a number of people in Ireland at the time was that a lot of the reforms that were brought in after the IMF bailout in Ireland, they had more of a negative effect on the poorer segments of the population and sort of had less of an effect at the top. And I think that's a fairly common complaint in countries where the IMF are bringing about policy changes. So to an extent that can be kind of a common criticism, as can be the fact that in a lot of countries, I suppose there are a lot of elites who would welcome some of the reforms and like what are seen as some of the efficiencies that can be brought in by them. But then the effect of this is often around things like public sector employees. And so I'd say probably some of the public sector employees in Ireland at the time who saw an effect on their salaries and on the hiring practices would probably have a similar perspective on the IMF policies as a number of the public sector employees in Ecuador who would have lost their jobs.
Okay, Maeve, what can we do in Ireland to try to encourage the IMF and other lenders around the world to bring in policies that are good for the peoples of the countries affected?
I think one of the biggest things that we can do is to engage with our representatives on this. I think that a lot of people just simply don't think that this is an issue people care about. From the Irish government perspective, some of the asks we would specifically have would be that the annual report that's prepared every year by the Irish government about the IMF and the World Bank, we'd argue that Irish aid should be involved in its production and that the report should be discussed in the Dáil so that there's a public scrutiny of it, which doesn't happen currently. I think that these are things that can often be seen as, they're complicated, they happen behind closed doors, maybe they don't have such a direct effect, but actually that they are hugely influential on people's lives. And so for people who are motivated about these issues and care about the effect that they have, I think even just saying to your local representatives or people canvassing who call around to the door and things like that, these are issues that are important, I think that has really substantial effect.
Do we still in Ireland owe money to the IMF? Do you know?
So our debt, actually, one resource, if people are interested, that's very helpful. So there's a UK organisation called Jubilee Debt Campaign, who are a sister agency of ours, and they have an interactive debt map with all the countries in the world, and you can click through. It's updated quite regularly with a breakdown of information there, and I'd really recommend that. And I don't know if they're still doing it, but Maeve and Evan Economic Research Institute used to produce an update on the breakdown of the debt and when it was due and who it was owed to. And that will provide an update. And another really good resource is just basically if you are interested in coming to our own website, we have some of the background of the process that happened there too.
Okay, Maeve, to come towards the end of the interview, is there anything else you want to get across to our listeners about your work on Financial Justice Ireland?
I suppose the main thing to say is the IMF and the World Bank, it can seem like it's a very complicated issue, but a lot of what we're trying to do with our work is to say to people, look, these actually all have a big effect on our lives here in Ireland, and they have a big effect on people overseas. We run a lot of events ranging from film clubs and book clubs to talks like the one we ran with Louise. And we run an evening course as well, and we aim to make it as accessible as possible. So if you're interested in these issues, even if you have no background in them and you don't know much about them, really do come along and get engaged. And even if you can't come to any of our events, something I will say is we've got to the point where people feel confident going to their doctor and discussing symptoms and, you know, feeling like they can say, well, look, I've done research into this and I think you need to take my concerns seriously, which is right. But when it comes to the economy, people feel like it's such an expert, you know, complicated issue that they don't always feel comfortable talking about it or raising it with people when actually, you know, it's much less scientific. It's much more about how you think the world should be run, and I'd really encourage people, if they're interested in justice issues like that, just try and get